All right, let's jump straight into this explainer by dropping you right into the absolute suffocating tension of ancient Jerusalem. The year is the 10th year of King Zedekiah's reign, which lines up exactly with the 18th year of the unstoppable global superpower of the day, the mighty King Nebuchadnezzar. His Babylonian army has completely surrounded the city. The siege mounts, these massive, imposing ramps of earth and debris built by the enemy, are piled so high against the walls that you can literally see them from inside the starving, panicked city. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. The food, entirely gone. The nation of Judah is going through this profound, agonizingly slow-motion collapse, and the society is basically flatlining. The tension inside those ancient stone walls is absolutely suffocating.
So, seriously, ask yourself, if your financial advisor told you to take your life savings right now and buy a piece of real estate in the middle of a literal, active war zone, would you do it? You'd think they were completely out of their mind. But today, we're looking at the prophet Jeremiah, who did exactly that. And his situation is even more absurd, honestly, because he's currently locked up in his own king's prison courtyard for warning everyone that the Babylonians were going to win. While sitting in that cell, listening to the battering rams slamming against the walls, Jeremiah gets a divine command to buy a field from his cousin, Hanamel, a field in Anathoth, which is dirt that is quite literally already occupied by the enemy camp. Despite the sheer madness of the situation, Jeremiah actually goes through with it. He doesn't just make some poetic, symbolic gesture. He pulls out the scales right there in the dusty prison courtyard and physically weighs out 17 shekels of silver. This highlights the undeniably tangible financial reality of this transaction. I mean, he's giving away precious silver, which, let's be real, was practically useless for buying food during a starvation-level siege anyway, to buy conquered dirt. On paper, it's like buying a house while the roof is actively caving in. It is total madness. Now, you know what's truly wild about this? Ancient property law is basically mirroring modern tech here. The text gets highly specific about the legal mechanics. Jeremiah creates 2 copies of the deed, which was standard practice back then in the ancient Near East, and he hands them over to his scribe, Baruch. The open deed was left unsealed for everyday public verification. Think of it kind of like a modern blockchain ledger that anyone can just quickly reference. But the sealed deed, that was the encrypted, securely locked copy. If the public system completely crashes, or if someone disputes the claim decades down the line, you break open that sealed vault for the ultimate, unalterable proof.
Jeremiah gives Baruch a really specific, vital instruction. Put these deeds into an earthen vessel, a clay jar, so they might last for many days. By placing these deeds into clay jars, he is utilizing the exact same preservation method that protected the Dead Sea Scrolls for thousands of years. It was deliberately designed to survive fire, destruction, and the test of time. By handing over those 17 shekels and sealing these documents, Jeremiah is putting his money where his mouth is. It was this profound, incredibly tangible act of faith that one day houses, fields, and vineyards really would be possessed again in this totally ruined land.
But there's a much deeper legal mechanism at play here with his cousin. In ancient agrarian Israel, land was your life. It was your identity and your family's only means of survival. If you fell into deep poverty, you risked permanent destitution. Enter the kinsman redeemer. This was a societal safety net where a close relative had the legal obligation to step in, pay the debt, and buy back the land. The source material uses this microscopic real estate transaction as a massive, macroscopic metaphor for humanity's condition. It suggests that humanity lost its spiritual inheritance and desperately requires an ultimate kinsman redeemer, the Messiah, to step in and pay the price.
We've all been there, right? Right after this incredibly bold, totally public display of faith, the prophet has a deeply relatable human reaction. The adrenaline wears off. I always liken it to a modern 3 a.m. mortgage panic. You know, you confidently sign the papers for a 30-year loan, shake hands, get the shiny new keys, and then you wake up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat staring at the ceiling thinking, oh my gosh, what have I just done? Jeremiah has this exact crisis in the courtyard. The reality of throwing away his silver while his city is actively falling to famine, pestilence, and the sword finally crashes down on him, and he just utters this desperate panic prayer. So how does a prophet handle a full-blown freakout? The way Jeremiah actually structures this 3 a.m. panic prayer is just a masterclass in psychological strategy for navigating doubt. He doesn't start by screaming about the Babylonians. Step 1, he actively grounds himself in the immense power of the divine. He praises God as the creator of the heavens and the earth, actively recalling past deliverances. Only after establishing that rock-solid foundation does he move to step 2, voicing the brutal, undeniable present contradictions. He points right at those siege mounds and essentially says, everything you said would happen is happening,
and yet you still told me to buy this field.
This brings up such a fascinating psychological insight from the text. Worship studies the heart before the answers arrive. Anchoring himself to past deliverance didn't make those massive Babylonian siege mounts magically disappear from outside his cell. Obviously, they were still there, but it completely changed his internal posture. When he was totally overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of his situation, grounding himself in what he already knew to be true gave him the firm foundation he needed to safely ask his hardest, most desperate questions.
Now, according to the text, the divine response comes back with uncompromising reality. The destruction of Jerusalem is confirmed, and the notes get extremely specific about why this is happening. The text outlines that the collapse isn't just some arbitrary event or divine tantrum. No, it's the result of persistent generational rebellion. The society had become terminally diseased. They were openly offering incense to false gods like Baal and committing the absolutely unthinkable horror of sacrificing their own children to the god Molech in the valley of Hinnom. The society was quite literally sacrificing its own future. So the impending destruction is framed as an act of aggressive, necessary surgery.
Yet, while Jeremiah is still sitting in that exact same, unchanging prison courtyard, the narrative makes this massive pivot to hope. A promise of future restoration is given. But here's the kicker. This doesn't happen because the people suddenly figured things out or improved their behavior. Not at all. The narrative introduces a concept called covenant mercy. A covenant is a legally binding treaty. When humanity completely broke their end of the contract, the relationship absolutely should have been severed, but in this framework, the divine steps in to fulfill both sides of the broken agreement, legally obligating himself to cleanse, pardon, and restore people who simply could not save themselves.
The sensory contrast here is wild. On one hand, you have Jeremiah's current brutal reality, a suffocating nightmare of warfare, screams, absolute desolation, and literal starvation. But then the text pivots to this stunning, holistic vision of the future. It promises that the desolate streets will once again hear the sounds of weddings, of immense joy and gladness, and of peaceful shepherds resting with their flocks. It is a complete 180-degree promise of future economic stability, social flourishing, and profound peace. To ensure this new society doesn't just loop back and repeat the horrors of the past, the promise includes what we can essentially think of as a software upgrade. God promises to give the people one heart and one way. Think about it. Rebuilding the external stone walls, the hardware, is completely useless if the internal operating system is still corrupted by rebellion. This promise guarantees an internal spiritual transformation, totally rewiring the human heart so that they will truly revere the divine forever.
But wait, this brings up a massive logistical problem. Who on earth is going to lead this beautifully restored nation? The current king, Zedekiah? He's an absolute disaster who led his people to literal slaughter and locked up his own prophet. The priests were totally corrupt, actively sacrificing to Baal. The human systems of leadership and mediation have completely failed on every single conceivable level. This severe institutional failure requires a completely new, eternal, structural overhaul to replace the totally broken human institutions.
All right, we're hitting the climax of the explainer here, and this is exactly where the title of our source text comes into play. God promises to grow a branch of righteousness. I want you to picture the royal line of King David as this massive, sprawling family tree that has just been violently chopped down by Babylonian axes, reduced to nothing but a biologically dead stump. The dynasty appears entirely finished. But defying all logic, a fresh, green shoot sprouts directly out of that dead wood. This branch points directly to the text's ultimate hope in a Messiah, an idealized king and high priest perfectly envisioned to completely fix that massive leadership vacuum.
Now put yourself back in the shoes of a starving civilian inside those walls. Talk is incredibly cheap when your city is burning and you haven't eaten in weeks. How can you possibly trust this massive, beautiful promise of an eternal king? Well, the text answers that ultimate question of faith by providing a jaw-dropping cosmic guarantee. It doesn't point to a reorganized army or some fancy new economic policy. It points directly to the physical universe itself, basically saying, if you can break my covenant with the day and my covenant with the night, it's offering what is essentially an unbreakable cosmic warranty. The text argues, go outside, try to stop the sun from setting, try to stop the stars from coming out tonight, try to halt the fundamental rotation of the Earth. Unless you somehow have the immense cosmic power to physically break the laws of astrophysics, this promise of restoration cannot be broken. Even when the people felt entirely cast off and destroyed, this staggering warranty claims that the divine promise stands as firmly and as undeniably as gravity itself.
So, what's the core takeaway from all this ancient history?
It's right here. True faith often requires us to buy the field before the siege lifts. It requires a tangible, incredibly costly investment in hope. When all the visible evidence around you points exclusively to despair, destruction, and total loss, you have to trust the unchanging character of the promise maker more than you trust the chaos of your current circumstances.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over today. Think about those legal deeds Jeremiah signed and securely locked inside those clay jars to survive the fire. He was actively leaving behind proof for generations he would never even meet. People who would one day return to a ruined land, needing hard evidence that a future was still possible. So, in your own life, when you're facing a season of desolation where the math just doesn't make sense, what earthen vessels are you leaving behind? What tangible, perhaps illogical actions of faith are you taking today that might serve as a map of hope for whoever finds them tomorrow?